To the BVRLA's first Fleets in Charge webinar of 2023, which we are also running as part of Transport Decarbonising Week. Got a fantastic lineup of speakers and panelists this morning. I'll also be sharing some of the insights from our latest research around EV charging and its fleet friendliness. But before we move on to that, I'm just going to do some of the basic housekeeping. So first of all, please do remember that all BVRLA events are held in compliance with competition law. So whilst we want you to use the chat functionality and also ask questions to the panel and the speakers using the Q&A tab that you've got on the top right hand side of your screen, please do refrain from any of the areas there mentioned in red. So please do don't put anything in the chat or questions that relate to individual suppliers, customers, anything that's commercially sensitive that relates to company plans, pricing, etc. But as long as we stay away from that area, then please do put your comments in the chat and questions in the Q&A. All of our webinars are recorded and will be available on the BVRLA's website afterwards. They'll also be available via the Transport Decarbonising Week website as well. So I'm going to kick us off this morning by talking through some of the latest research that we've done around EV charging. So Fran, if you can bring the slides up for me. So we are going to be publishing a revised fleet charging guide that looks at how we recognise fleet users' needs when we're developing EV infrastructure strategies. If we move on to the next one, please, Fran. So we first published the fleet charging guide about this time last year, and there were a few reasons why we did that. Firstly, we recognised that the government was about to launch its EV infrastructure strategy, so it was just ahead of the government producing that, and we knew that fleets weren't going to be the primary focus, but we wanted to ensure that they did have some reference throughout the strategy. We were also working with the EV Energy Task Force on some modelling that it was doing. And it was quite clear when we were speaking to policymakers that there was a bit of a knowledge gap when it came to private sector fleets. And we wanted to produce a guide to help plug that gap. We also recognised that local authorities were getting greater responsibilities around the planning and provision of charging infrastructure. And we wanted the local authorities to understand what fleet users were going to need, but also to recognise the diversity of different fleet use cases. So, you know, a number of local authorities hadn't necessarily had much involvement with fleets in the past, but all of a sudden were being asked to plan local infrastructure. We wanted to make sure that they could understand that there are different usage profiles across fleet, that fleet is hugely diverse, but then also recognise some of the challenges that some of those different users were going to face, and then also try and match up those users to a preferred type of charging. So the report then made a number of high-level policy recommendations that were aimed at policymakers from both central and local government, but we very much saw this as a start point, something that we're able to build on over time, and really something that we wanted to use to start that engagement process and to start, you know, working with local authorities to develop their understanding and their knowledge around what fleet users need. So if we move on to the next one. So we produced this one-page graphic as part of the report, and this really shows the diversity of the different fleet use cases. And then, as I said, it was an easy way for us to show that diversity, but also to start to show some of the different charging challenges that different users were going to face. And then based on those challenges and their usage profiles, we were able to match the different users up to a preferred type of charging, but also show that other charging was likely to be needed, even if they did have that sort of preference. So we, you know, where we had use cases such as things like taxis, car clubs, rental vehicles that have high levels of utilization and fast turnaround times, their preference was likely to be for rapid charging. We then looked at company cars and disabled users, where obviously their preference would be for at home or even workplace charging. Then we looked at the commercial vehicle fleet, both in terms of vans that are taken home by the drivers that would need some form of near home charging, and also those that were depot based. So if we move on to the next slide, please, Fran. So we also, after we did the fleet charging guide, we then also do an annual piece of research where we assess progress on the road to zero, called our Road to Zero report card. And this gave us the opportunity to go into a bit more detail around some of the infrastructure challenges. So if you see here, we really focused on the commercial vehicle sector's needs, particularly with things like van accessibility of charge points. So it's not just that the charge points aren't often long enough, the cables are too short, there's often height restrictions. So even if there is somewhere secure that the vans can go overnight, they can't access those charge points if they're in a car park. But also maneuverability. Quite often you find that not only is the vehicle hanging over the bay, but it's really difficult for them to maneuver in and out of the space. And we've heard some fleets tell us about where they're having to actually reverse out onto main roads, which obviously has some health and safety impacts. So we're really keen that vans are being thought about as people are developing and designing infrastructure. And then on the HGV side, the main issue there is that there was a lack of a sort of powertrain roadmap. So whilst people are starting to look at where they can make battery electric vehicles work, when it comes to the sort of definitely the heavier duty and the longer range journeys, it's quite clear that there's still quite a lot of uncertainty around whether it's going to be battery electric, whether it's going to be hydrogen, or even if there's going to be solutions like catenary. And that makes it really difficult for people to start thinking about how they plan the infrastructure when we still have that uncertainty. So if we go on to the next slide, please, Fran. So we also incorporated some key performance indicators in the Road to Zero report card as well. And that gave us an overall rating. So the overall rating for last year was amber brakes on, and that had actually gone backwards when we compared it to the previous year, which had been amber accelerating. And the reason for that was, whilst we recognise that, you know, we are seeing much faster deployment of charging infrastructure, when we actually look at how much of it was designed with fleet users in need, so things like having data to enable roaming, looking at how much engagement was happening between fleets and local authorities, and then, you know, back to that key point around the suitability of charging infrastructure for vans and other commercial vehicles. That's why we led to that overall rating. So next slide, please, Fran. So when we publish the latest fleet charging guide, which we'll be publishing next week, we'll also alongside that be publishing some research that we've done, where we've done a freedom of information request to all upper tier local authorities, asking them about where they are with their EV infrastructure strategies, and also looking at how fleet friendly these are. So we found that 68% of local authorities have infrastructure strategies that have either been completed or in development. But when it comes to looking at how fleet friendly there are and how much engagement is happening between fleets and the local authorities, and also, you know, how they're deploying that infrastructure and thinking about fleets in their strategies, there were only a few examples of good practice. And whilst the message about van accessibility did seem to be seeping through, and we did see some areas where people are starting to accommodate vans by putting in larger bays, it was quite clear that in the majority of responses, when local authorities answered the questions, they were either thinking mainly about their own fleets and how they're going to decarbonise their own fleets, or they were looking at a very specific segment. So, for example, they'd refer to how they were working with the bus fleet or what they were doing with taxi operators, and not necessarily thinking about the full diversity of fleet users' needs. So we want to use this research and also the latest charging guide to develop our relationship with local authorities, and to get them thinking about how they can develop EV infrastructure so that it can cater for all users and vehicle types, but also how we overcome an issue that seems to be starting to emerge, where there's been quite a lot of negative press with some commercial vehicle operators, particularly those that take their vans home, and in some regards are seen as sort of hogging public charging. So I think that is a real critical point that we're going to have to overcome and make sure that we are striking the right balance, because these people are local residents. If they're taking their vans home, yes, it may have the company name on the side of the van, but they are still a local resident that needs to be able to charge that vehicle, particularly if they're not depot based. But also these are people that are coming into our local neighbourhoods to fix our boilers, to install our broadband, etc. And it's really important that we're able to accommodate them, and infrastructure can cater for them as well. So if the next slide, please, Fran. So there's a couple of new sections in the latest version of the charging guide. We've really wanted to do more of a sort of deep dive into some of the more complex user cases and areas where we're seeing challenges that aren't really disappearing. So the first area that we've looked at in the latest guide is rental operations at airports. So it's quite clear that if you look at rental operators and the airport operators, they're working to slightly different timescales. So the airport has its own decarbonisation plan, but the rental operator is likely to be the first mover in terms of electric vehicles at airports because of the 2030, 2035 phase out date that they're working to. Putting in EV infrastructure can be a challenge at the best of times, but there are lots of added complexity when it comes to airports in terms of the different stakeholders that they need to be engaging with. And there are a range of charging options that are being considered. So, whether rental operators are looking at what they can put at their own sites, looking at how they can be supported by the private sector and deployment of charging infrastructure in and around the airport. But some airport operations are also looking at whether there are going to be shared sites, for all of the different operators that are using the airports. And that can be a challenge too, and it raises a number of questions such as, how many rental bays will be available for the rental operators? How will they to be divided amongst the different rental operators at the airport? How do they consolidate payments and make sure that it works with their own systems? And also, who's responsible for maintenance? But it was quite clear from a number of the conversations that we had when doing the interviews for the latest guide that I think there is a lack of engagement. So it makes it very difficult for the rental operators to plan when they're not fully aware of what else is being considered as part of the airport's wider decarbonisation planning. So that's a new segment that we've drilled into. We've also started to look at the HGV transition. And it was quite clear from the interviews that we did that we're still at a very early stage of development for HGVs. There is still that ongoing powertrain uncertainty, particularly at the heavier end and the longer range journeys. So the focus has really been on medium duty trucks that have got a back to base model where they can charge at the depot and where battery electric is likely to be a more viable solution. But then we come across the issues around depot charging and grid connections. Everyone who we interviewed for the latest guide mentioned grid connections as being a problem for them. So it's not just the cost of the grid connection, but also the time that it's taking. We recognise that Ofgem are going to be bringing in new proposals from the 1st of April, where effectively they will socialise some of the cost where people are having to upgrade their grid connection. But there is a lot of scepticism about what this actually means. There's still a huge amount of uncertainty about what this means, but also how much of a material difference it will actually make, with some operators even saying that they worry that the situation will worsen, because where we have delays at every stage of the process, if people have got to go back and get a new quote based on the new price, then is this going to cause a further backlog and further delays? But the main issue that came out was that there's a lack of consistency across the DNOs, the distribution network operators who are responsible for providing that power, at every stage of the process, and different timings that are being used. So there'll be a number of recommendations around that whole grid connection area as well. So if we move on to the last slide in terms of next steps. So the fleet charging guide, along with the local authority maps and that other research that I just shared, will be launched next week on the 15th of March. We will be holding a parliamentary reception where we'll be calling on MPs to signal their commitment to helping work with local authorities and other key stakeholders to encourage them to think about fleet users' needs. We will also be engaging with local authorities, subnational transport bodies. We've already started working with some of the subnational transport bodies on more regional EV infrastructure strategies, and we will continue that and sort of do more outreach, and also look at how we can work more closely with the local authority support body that's been set up. Aaron from OZEV will talk in just a moment about the Levi Fund, which has been launched to local authorities, and also this support body. So there's opportunities there. And then we'll be progressing recommendations with the various stakeholders, whether that's with OZEV, the local authorities, the DNOs and the airports. So please do look out for that coming next week. That will be available on our website. And yeah, I'll leave it there, but I will hand over to Aaron Berry. So Aaron is the deputy head who's responsible for energy and infrastructure at the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles. So morning, Aaron, and I will hand over to you.
Good morning, Catherine. Good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm one of a number of deputy heads these days responsible for infrastructure. I think there are 5 or 6 of us now, which sort of reflects the growing priority of addressing infrastructure needs for electric vehicles. So my particular focus is on local EV charging infrastructure, but I'll give you a sort of an overview of where we're at on infrastructure and where we are going. So next slide, please, Fran. So just to put it all in context, many of you will be pretty familiar with this. We in 2021, we published our transport decarbonisation plan and the net zero strategy. So that this enormous challenge that we all have to achieve net zero by 2050, and transport is an enormous part of that. It's still the largest UK contributor to carbon emissions. Something like 1/4 of emissions are from transport. So cracking this nut is extremely important, and we set out how we would go about doing that in our transport decarb plan in 2021. Yeah, you can see the chart on the left sort of illustrates the scale of the challenge. It really is enormous. There are lots of measures that we need in order to achieve that sort of green path gliding down to zero by 2050. Cars and vans are an enormous part of that. There's something like half of the emissions of transport, of domestic transport emissions. So if we crack that nut, we will be a long way to achieving our objectives. Next slide, please, Fran. And that was very much sort of electrification. Moving to zero emission vehicles is therefore sort of a key part of achieving decarbonising transport. It's not just about vehicles. Changing the way we travel is also important. Greater focus on public transport, on alternative methods, walking and cycling, etc. We need all the tools in the box, but EVs are certainly one of them. And we are going to see an enormous ramp up over the course of the next 7 or 8 years or so. So something like 10 million vehicles on UK roads will need a plug or have a plug by 2030. We've got something like 1 million today. So that's just a tenfold increase in the course of the next 7 years. It is enormous. And we will need a lot of charging infrastructure to go alongside that. We have something like 37,000 today. So the chart on the right illustrates the rise in public charging infrastructure over the course of the last 7 years or so. It's a pretty exponential rise. It needs to continue on that path, and that is our major challenge. We do have one of the best networks in Europe, one of the most extensive networks in Europe at the moment. but there is clearly a long way to go. You can see the headlines in the press. You can see the occasional queues at service stations in busy periods. That there is a lot to do in this space. Next slide, please, Fran. And that's why the government set out their infrastructure charging strategy again last year, to set out our vision for what sort of infrastructure we would set out to achieve over the course of the next decade or so. So central to the vision is that basically everyone can find and access reliable public charge points wherever they live. And we know that that is a major concern, particularly for people without access to off-street parking. Most EV owners today can park and charge at home overnight, start every day with a full tank. But as the EV penetration grows over time, that opportunity will be less available to the newer EV users. So we need to make sure, regardless of where you live, you can charge your EV. Effortless on and off street charging for both private and commercial drivers. So Catherine referenced earlier, return to fleet or return to home fleet users. An awful lot of their drivers don't have access to off-street parking, and clearly they will need to have provision. A reliable network of high-powered charge points along major roads, both for fleet users and all of us. Occasionally we do that long journey, or we're regular drivers of over long periods, need good services across the motorway network. And the consumer experience is also really important. So the last slide on the right there. So fairly priced and inclusively designed public charge point that's trusted by consumers. So they need to be reliable, they need to be easily accessible, easy to pay. Market-led rollout for the majority of charge points backed by competition. So the government clearly has a role in ensuring good charging infrastructure, but most charge points are actually led and installed by the private sector, and we want to see that continue, and if anything, increase over time. And infrastructure seamlessly integrated into a smart energy system. So if you're ever talking to anyone about EVs, they will immediately say, well, have we got enough grid capacity to run all these EVs? The short answer in the near term is that we have enough for now, but we do need to grow our capacity over time, and we need to use our energy more smartly. And that's one of the things that we can do in this space. There's a huge opportunity in this space to use energy more smartly, to charge overnight, for example, on smart tariffs. And finally, continued innovation to meet drivers' needs. This is an emerging market. And we need to stay agile in our approach to charging infrastructure provision as the technology changes over time. Next slide, please, Fran. So the focus of our intervention is in 3 areas. So I've referenced already consumer experience, so making charge points easy to pay for, reliable, making sure that consumers are able to know if the charge point is operating or not, and how much it will charge, etc. We consulted, we published a response to our consultation last year. We expect to be regulating on those measures shortly. So in the coming months, there will be secondary legislation that will set out the requirements following our response to the consultation. So a really important measure we've been making good progress on. The pace of the rollout, particularly in the local space, which I'll come on to a little bit more, is too slow. We have patchy provision at the moment, particularly for on-street charging for people without access to home charging. That's my key focus. And thirdly, charging for long journeys, so making sure that there's sufficient provision across the strategic road network, particularly on motorways. And again, we're making good progress there. Every motorway service area should have at least 6 high-powered charge points by the end of this year. That's the initial target, but that will grow again exponentially over the course of the next decade to have a really good provision across the motorway service areas, and that's backed by very significant funding. So moving on to the local space in particular. Next slide, please, Fran. So yeah, the local challenge, my particular focus. So our vision I've set out already. Everyone can find and access reliable public charge points wherever they live. We have something like, as I said, 37,000 odd public charge points today. We need to have something between 280 720,000 total public charge points in just 7 years. So something like a tenfold increase in 7 years, an enormous challenge for us all. Some of those will need to be, or many of those will need to be in the sort of local space. One of the challenges we have today is really high regional disparity in deployment. So the map on the right illustrates, or the shading illustrates, the number of public charge points per 100,000 of the population. So you can see really wide variability at the moment, and we really need to even that up, to level that out, so there's more equitable regional access for all drivers. Another major challenge in this space, which I think Catherine referenced earlier, was that local authorities often lack the resource to plan and deliver the infrastructure that they need to. That is something else that we've been working on. We've made an announcement, which I'll come on to just a month, or just a few weeks ago, in fact, how we will be addressing that. So our vision is to have every local authority will have resource dedicated to EV charging infrastructure delivery. Next slide, please, Fran. So the funding announced on 21st of February was that UK drivers will benefit from an additional 56 million of government and industry funding for increasing EV charge points across the country. That comprised an extension of the 22 million to the Levi pilots, who are testing our approach to local charging infrastructure funding. That covered 16 new projects and 3 expanded projects from the pilot that we ran last summer. So we had a 10 million pilot last summer, and that will deliver something like 2,400 additional charge points. Just as importantly, perhaps more importantly, we launched 8 million of our Levi Capability Fund, and that will equip local authorities with the skill and ambition, capacity to scale up charge point planning. They really have a fundamental role. They are the highways operators. So if you want a charge point on your street, it's the local authority that will be responsible for providing that. So they need to have the resource in order to deliver it. We also announced a further 7 million for our current scheme in the on-street space, which is called the On-Street Residential Charge Point Scheme. That brings the total funding for that scheme up to 37 million this year. That's nearly twice what we had last year, which itself was doubling from the year before. So we really are sort of ramping up capacity in this area across the piece, both capital and resource. Next slide, please, Fran. So what is Levi? What are we trying to do in this space? Well, we have 2 key objectives. The first is delivering a step change in the scale of deployment of primarily low power on-street charging infrastructure across England. So to date, we've had relatively small and patchy rollout, so the odd charge point here and there going into local authority car parks, a couple on a street here and there. We have a tremendous opportunity to massively scale up that deployment. The second is around accelerating the commercialization and investment in local charging infrastructure. So again, to date, local charging infrastructure provided by local authorities has tended to be very heavily subsidized, and that's not something that's sustainable over time, and not something that actually needs to be sustainable over time, because there is tremendous commercial opportunities in this space. So we intend to leverage a lot more private sector investment to massively scale up the deployment and increase the pace as well. So the Levi Fund comprises 3 elements. So capital funding to support the deployment of infrastructure and help leverage that private sector investment. The Capability Fund to ensure that local authorities have the resources and capacity to help deliver it, to develop commercial contracts to go out to the private sector and get really good charging infrastructure. And finally, something else that Catherine referenced earlier, provision of tools, training, and sharing of best practice through our Levi support body. So we have Cenex, PA Consulting, and the Energy Savings Trust as a support body to help deliver the program and really ramp up infrastructure in the course of the next few years. I think I have one more slide, Fran. So just referencing the sort of how Levi fits with fleets, and probably won't need to tell any of you, but they're an important early adopter market. So while people with driveways and tending to be sort of richer folks have bought EVs to date, fleets also have an important role in the sort of early adopter market, and many of their drivers do need to return home at night and park and charge. So the fit with Levi is that it supports residential charging, including those that take their vehicles home. So in terms of how we've thought about and developed the funding, we've engaged extensively on the design of the Levi funding, so it's more flexible than the offer that we had through our on-street residential charging scheme. So more autonomy to local authorities to think about how it can best meet their charging needs, what sorts of technologies they need to use. It will include some level of rapid charging, for example, if that's what they want to support, or innovative solutions like gullies, which allow private residents to have private charge points on their homes, but still be able to charge their vehicles on the street. Encouraging, and this is something that we will be doing a lot of, encouraging LAs, DNOs, CPOs, and indeed fleets, public transport boards, and other stakeholders to share rollout plans to identify what the demands will be in local areas over time, where that demand will be, so we can develop and roll out that infrastructure at pace, but in a sensible way over the course of the next decade or so. We've published a lot of guidance in this space. We've published the LA Toolkit in March 22. We have a knowledge repository that the support body will be providing on things like commercial contracts and identifying local charging needs. And we will also publish very shortly guidance to local authorities, which we've produced with the IET. So I will stop there. I see I'm sort of slightly past time. I can see questions jumping into the chat there.
Thanks, Aaron. And yeah, there are quite a few questions. So we haven't got that long, but I'll try and cover some off. So there's a question here from Helen Armstrong. Are you considering the impact of EV consumption data on energy monitoring and targeting? So it says, we see energy management plans affected once EV charging starts on site. They lose the ability to identify what's an EV and what is building consumption. It's something not being considered in the strategy stage when putting in infrastructure and chargers. Anything on that one?
Not entirely sure I follow that one. Maybe that's one to take offline. Energy monitoring and targeting. Yeah, probably one to take offline.
Okay, we'll follow up on that one.
Yeah.
There's a question here from Daniel Walker. How much of the strategy is relying on the market-led installation of chargers as opposed to government-led?
So I think in the local authority space, they need to have a role because they are the highways authority. So you can't put charging infrastructure on streets, on lampposts, etc., unless you're involving the local authority. But that doesn't mean it needs to be entirely publicly funded. So one of the things that we've been doing a lot of work on is to develop commercial models, commercial offers that will leverage private funding, so market-led support, with on the back of public funding to support where there is a degree of market failure. So that is an important aspect of the sort of the public sector and the private sector working together effectively to deliver charging infrastructure deployment. Many sectors elsewhere in the infrastructure market are being market led at the moment. So home chargers, for example, we initially supported home chargers for people with driveway access. We had a grant the electric vehicle home charge scheme running for many years, which sort of stimulated that market. It now stands on its own 2 feet, and therefore that funding has been removed. And equally in sort of in the destination spaces, so you're seeing charge points going up in Lidl and McDonald's and so on and so forth. That is all entirely private sector led. It doesn't need public support, and therefore, we're focusing on the market failure areas. So in short, I think we'll see a combination, and over time, I think we'll see more and more being led by the market.
Thanks, Erin. I'm going to take a couple more and then I will have to wrap it up. There's one here, and it's something that I certainly hear quite a lot. There's a question here from Neil Page saying, it's fair enough the government are installing lots of chargers, but where do you get the power to charge 10 million vehicles in 2030?
So I answered that sort of very briefly, that there's a lot of planning that goes on at national level to look at EV uptake. So we already know that there are going to be around 10 million vehicles. So we are already actively planning for it. And I think that's one of the many upsides to setting out clear targets and regulating for them for EV uptake, because it gives everybody certainty. It gives the electricity planners certainty on how much energy will be provided. It gives the auto manufacturers certainty so they can start investing to achieve those targets, and equally for infrastructure planners to know broadly how many charge points we will need. The main measures for addressing that sort of those energy targets are obviously it's increased generation, but it's also smarter use of the energy. So having smart charge points, and that's something else that we've regulated for. It's one of the purposes of the smart chargers that we all or the smart meters that we have in our homes, that will be ramped up over time. So there'll be off-peak tariffs, and that's already available for some EV charging. So to encourage the right behaviors which will allow us to get better use from the energy capacity that we have today while we're growing that capacity at the same time.
Thanks. And I'm going to do one more. So a question from Mark Palmer that says the investment in resources is good news, but what practical support does the Levi support body provide? And I guess my tag on to that would be, and how does that help with the sort of fleet users?
So quite a lot of support. So I've mentioned the procurement support already, and I think that's probably one of the most important, because to date, the contracts that local authorities have put in place with EV charge point providers have really varied dramatically in terms of their quality and their ability to meet residents' needs. So we've done a lot of work in that space. We'll shortly have a sort of a heads of terms available for local authorities to use that will go out to the market. And that will also make it easier for the charge point operators to engage and be more efficient in their engagement with procurement. So that's absolutely massive. But there's lots more support besides. So for example, on the development of EV strategies, the sorts of things to take into account in developing those strategies, modeling tools to help them identify their charging needs over time, the sort of basics on EV charging infrastructure, different sorts of charge points. I mean, it's almost endless. So there's a really extensive knowledge repository being developed, and there's also one-to-one support. So the reason that we have that combination of Energy Savings Trust, PA Consulting and Cenex is to provide the technical support, the commercial support, also an understanding of how local authorities operate. So we think we've got a really good offer for local authorities going forward, and yeah, I'm really quite excited about it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Erin. And sorry that we didn't get through everybody's questions, but thank you for posing them. And if we can come back on them, we will do. Erin, thank you so much, and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you. Okay. So next we have this morning's panel. So I'd like to introduce Denise Beadell, who is the Senior Policy Manager at Logistics UK. We have Paul Gambrell, Team Leader for ZEV and Energy Integration Innovation Team at Oxfordshire County Council. Connor McAvoy, who is the UK Change Project Manager and EV Lead at Hertz. And Andre Diaz, who is the founder and CTO of Duluth. Good morning to you all.
Morning. Morning.
Okay. We don't have much time because we're overrunning, but a question to you all to start. It is nearly a year on since the government's EV infrastructure strategy. So what progress do you think has been made over the past year, and where do you feel the sort of priority area of focus should be as we move through the remainder of sort of 23 into 24? Denise, we'll start with you.
Hi. Well, I think actually the growing awareness that is starting to actually take root that of the role that fleets are playing. I think that's a follow-on from where we were with better knowledge of the logistics system completely through the pandemic. I think probably that awareness seems to be coming down a little bit now. But having said that, I think talking to policymakers and reading the sort of announcements that we're getting from government, I think the recognition that local authorities do need more knowledge and that able to obtain dedicated resource is good, particularly with that announcement last week. And I think there's also that understanding that the more important element of all of this is making sure that we get the power supply. There's still a concern about the acquisition of the vehicles themselves, but I think the power issue is much higher up on people's agenda now.
Thanks, Denise. Connor, can I ask the same question to you?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely echo Denise's words. I think awareness has dramatically improved over the last year. I think the biggest challenge, especially for us, is power upgrades, interacting with DNOs and the fragmented service that we get, I think is quite challenging, and timeframes seem to be a real challenge as well. It is getting better. I just don't think it's moving at the pace that a lot of fleet companies need it to move at.
Thanks, Connor. Paul?
Talking from an Oxford point of view, awareness has turned into real appreciable amounts of battery electric vehicles on the roads now. We've got good infrastructure being put in place. And I think the big move for us as a local authority is what Aaron was talking about, the fact that the Levi scheme's coming in and we've got sight of funding to enable us to do what we need to do for a period coming up.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And finally, Andre, same question.
Yeah, well, from our perspective on the user side and from our customers, what we're seeing really is that a lot of really big fleet electrification projects are coming to reality. So you see a lot of both public institutions and major companies really making the shift and really taking a global plan, right, on where to install charging stations at their own facilities, how they handle public charging, home charging, and you see also the regulations coming into place to support those changes. So we see it all moving in the good direction, still a lot of challenges, but really interesting use cases coming up.
Great, thanks. And if we sort of focus on some of the key themes that are going to be coming out from the latest fleet charging guide. So if we start maybe on that accessibility for commercial vehicles, which we know has been a problem. And Denise, maybe if I start with you, what do you think needs to happen so that charging is more accessible for commercial vehicles?
Well, I think the focus needs to actually go onto vans. I think, if anything, there's been a bit of a shift that cars is sorted. Let's look at HGVs. And I think there's been a huge bit that's been forgotten about, the 4.6 million commercial vans that are on our roads. Now, if you're a car-derived van that's the same floor plan as a Fiesta or a Corsa, then you're not going to have a problem. But that's not where the majority of commercial van operators are. They're actually in those 2.5 ton to 3.5 ton. And they tend to have longer wheelbases. They tend to be taller and wider. So then we get those awful pictures of one van taking up 2 spaces and a lot of angry car users. I also think that there's an issue there with sort of almost those public charge point spaces are almost seen as the property entirely of car users. And I think we need to understand that the public charge point network does need to be used by all vehicles that use our roads, regardless of them. It's a public asset and it actually is there for everybody. But I would like to actually see more understanding and targets, perhaps, to make sure that we do have enough dedicated van spaces, because without them, we're just not going to get the goods and services delivered into our communities, into our local economies. Yes, HGV charging also needs to be looked at, but we don't quite know where that's going yet. So I think, I think a bit more focus on the vans. Well, actually, a lot more focus on the vans is what I'd like to see.
Thanks, Denise. And how important is the ability to sort of book? So, you know, when yes, you want the accessible charge points, and, you know, you're saying about getting targets to make sure we have them. How important is the bookability aspect to sort of reduce any downtime impacts?
I think there's a lot of operators would like to have that. Equally, there's some uncertainty, because the last thing they want to do is book somewhere and get there and discover it's vandalized. So I think we actually need to make sure that the data infrastructure also is robust and reliable, and people can have that certainty that if they do book somewhere, it will be free, it will be working. And also perhaps that needs to go hand in hand with some robust enforcement to make sure that you know, that people can rely on that booking system. If that isn't there, then people will stop using it, and there'll just be a free-for-all and a Wild West again.
Yeah, thanks, Denise. And Andre, you know, from your experience, when we talk about bookability and also, I guess, the ability to roam, have you seen any examples where this is working well, and anything that we could learn in the UK to help sort of facilitate this?
Yeah, sure. Well, the bookability issue is one that has not yet been sorted, I would say. There's always the problem of how can you book a public space, right, and occupy it for some individual. So typically what you would see is that there's the functionality there, but then from a business and legal perspective, it is rarely enforced. But for vans, what we're seeing more and more in a number of countries is basically you have private charging hubs. So typically in private run facilities, where actually you can enforce things like scheduled charging, and you have like half an hour slots for fast charging, ultra fast charging that you predict and rely upon. And again, there's not going to be the issue about data quality, because it's a paid service, so it's supposed to be provided with a very high level of service. So that's one thing. But the other one, which sometimes is even worse, is like you own a van or your business, you have an EV card or an app. How do you make sure that you go to one where you can actually charge? So what we're seeing, and well, the country where our base is located, which is Portugal, actually we went to the extreme, and by law, it is mandatory that all charging stations are open to all providers. So this means that roaming is mandatory by design, right? What you see in countries like in the UK and well, most other countries, is that this is typically a bottom-up approach, where you have bilateral agreements between networks and providers, and then they create their own bundles that they can offer to companies, right? Of course, then it's almost like a land grab and competition, and eventually the best one will win. But the thing is, how do you design a system, or should you design a system that is open by design, so that you don't create barriers for anyone to just go and charge? But how can you still enforce competition at the same time? So I think that is a very important policy challenge at the EU level, at UK level, across the world, really.
Thanks for that, Andre. Fascinating. Sticking with commercial vehicles, and from a sort of county council perspective, Paul, what is Oxfordshire County Council doing to sort of engage with the fleet community to understand their charging needs, and when you're developing your own infrastructure sort of strategies, deployment, etc.?
Well, right from the early days when I was involved in working on EVs in Oxfordshire, we had projects going on that meant we were talking with fleets in Oxfordshire to try and understand what they needed. And I'm talking commercial van type fleets more than anything. And we rolled that into our EV infrastructure strategy, which we published back in 2021. I think it's true to say that the agenda continues to move on, and we continue engaging with fleets to try and understand their perspective. And we deliberately only wrote that strategy to be a 5-year strategy. So it actually ends at the end of 2025, because we knew things were going to change very rapidly, and we weren't going to second guess what was necessary. So we're already beginning to think about what do we put in the next strategy, and how does that meet the needs of our fleet operators. And vans in particular will form a big part of that. And as Denise has already said, we're beginning to think about HGV but it is still very early days, and the technologies are still really to be fully decided upon before we can make judgments that will be meaningful.
Yeah. And when I think I mentioned it and Denise mentioned it as well, you know, that sort of perception around public charging is for the public, not necessarily for how do you strike the right balance between your local residents and the commercial vehicle drivers that are going to be...
We've not actually had much of a problem with that.
Okay.
I don't know whether that's because we finished a project at the tail end of last year where we installed 250 standard type charge points across 20 car parks in Oxfordshire. So the minimum number of charge points we had in any single car park was 10. Now, whether it's because we went at scale, so people are not seeing the car parks log jammed, I don't know whether that's why we don't have this issue, but we actually have been trying to encourage van drivers into using those charging hubs with some success. And I've certainly not picked up any backlash from local residents or users of the car park saying that there's a problem. I should also point out, where possible, we've also tried to put in some wider bays so that they're more accessible to a van, and actually also at this stage for people with disabilities, because we don't have actual blue badge charging points. But, you know, we have been trying to also give accessibility in that way to people who need it as well.
Yeah, fantastic. I see Denise smiling and nodding. If we just move on quickly to airports, which is another of the new sections in the report. Connor, can you tell us a bit more about the complexity of trying to install charging infrastructure at your rental branches and how this is different at airports?
Yeah, absolutely. Generally, you know, when we're installing at an airport, obviously there's a lot more complexity around getting permits. You have to generally go through multiple departments within the organisation. There's a lack of commitment to an SLA on when you will install, and there's also different requirements, and it's a bit fragmented. Different airports want different requirements of the installs as well. We don't have access to the power and understanding what we need and what is required. Again, we're reliant on the airport sharing data. And then in terms of where we install a local downtown location, now power is generally in smaller supply. So, you know, we would have to apply to a DNO for a power upgrade, and that brings the complexities and longer time frames of installs. Again, quite difficult to get communication between the DNO and ourselves and project leads and the time frame that entails. So it just really, you know, airports in general are slower in installing for our landlords where we do have the power. So yeah, you know, it's just a collaboration needs to be come together to work together in order to install these quicker. We are starting to see that at some airports where they're appointing sort of leads in EV infrastructure. Unfortunately, as you mentioned before, we don't have a insight into what their future plans are. So we potentially go off on our journey to install chargers in order to meet our requirements, not knowing the larger and picture that may happen.
Yeah, thanks, Connor. And you mentioned a lot there about the sort of grid upgrades. So away from airports and back to your rental branches when you're looking to install that infrastructure there. What are the main issues when it comes to the sort of grid connections process that are causing the delays and the issues?
I mean, the main issues, obviously, you know, it's quite a fragmented service from the DNO. You have to apply for a survey. There's different SLAs depending on the DNO that you're working with in what area. I think there's a lack of competition between the DNOs as well. You've got an appointed DNO per area, so you have to work with them. There's, you know, they outsource some of the work as well, and then you don't always know what the project lead or the project lead that the DNO has appointed and the subsequent work that needs to be done in order to install at your location. They generally work differently depending on which organisation you're having to use.
Yeah, thanks, Connor. And Denise, is that a similar story when people are looking to upgrade their depots? Is that the same sort of themes that are coming out from your members?
We heard sort of whispers of that. I think probably you've given me some insights into some of the actual practical concerns about dealing with DNOs at the installation phase, so to speak. Most of our members are trialing at this stage. There's a few that are starting to do it at scale, but I would say those are the ones that for whom their actual capacity at sites and mileage ranges work well. They're going for the low-hanging fruit, basically. I think they're aware that there are some big hurdles to overcome going forward, but at the moment they're focused mainly on how much this is all going to cost. So.
Yeah. And when it comes to that sort of cost reduction, one of the things that we started to explore when we were doing the interviews this time was around the ability to sort of share the infrastructure. So we've heard some examples where, bus operators who have put in depot-based infrastructure are potentially looking to open that to other fleet operators, or, could, if lots of people are looking to upgrade at the same time, is there a role there for the DNO to bring them together? So Denise, Connor, what do you think about that sort of sharing of infrastructure?
I think that if I go first, if there is a lot of interest in the sharing of infrastructure, I think it fits with a lot of companies' CSR policies, etc. But there are still concerns about safety, commercial security, particularly for some operators. I think we mentioned airports there. I think that would be a very difficult area to share because of the sensitivity of all the security protocols that they have to go through. But I think there are going to be opportunities in some places for that to happen. But I think it goes back to all that collaboration piece. Who do you talk to? How do you engage with them? Do you all speak the same language? We've already noticed this is a problem working with the energy sector. It's a completely different technology for our operators. They're having to learn about this while still maintaining operations. And I think there is actually, I think all parties need to be willing to actually understand each other's challenges much better. And I'm not sure how we approach that, but I think that needs to happen.
Yeah, I'll agree, Denise. I mean, sharing a facility at a rental business is quite complex. How do we guarantee having the availability of the chargers? There's some guarantees around the reconciliation of the energy as well. And it's all dependent on the speed of the chargers that are installed. Our airports are quite a high volume, high utilization operation. So, if low powered chargers are actually installed, that probably wouldn't meet our needs and actually cause us impact cause an impact on our business at the airport around turning and how quickly we can turn vehicles around.
Yeah, thanks, Connor. And Paul, from a sort of council, local authority point of view, do you think there's potentially a role for local authorities to bring interested businesses together if there's a willingness to share?
Probably yes. We have actually had a couple of discussions with various people who have expressed the idea of trying to do such a thing. But as Denise and Connor have both said, they have foundered largely because of the whole security aspect and how they would actually practically be run. We've also examined it from our own estate point of view. As part of the Oxfordshire County Council highways fleet, there's going to be a whole load of infrastructure in charging equipment in the not too distant future. So we're having internal discussions about, is there a way that we can make that available to other people as well? So yeah, trying to share is definitely a good idea. Yeah. The practicality of doing it can be more challenging.
Yeah, definitely. And Andre, from a sort of technical solutions point of view, have you seen any examples, or are there technical solutions that can sort of help with the sharing?
Yeah, technically, well, the challenges are all the same. So we're always talking about roaming. So how do you use someone else's infrastructure? So fortunately, more and more, all the charging stations that we now have in place, at least in private locations in the UK, are smart connected chargers. So you can actually do a lot of stuff with them and enforce rules for access to those charging stations. But I would say that the challenge also there, and this we're seeing this, is also again business related. So it's kind of like the buy or build challenge, where do I invest in my own charging infrastructure, right? And how do I fund it? Or do I bring someone else to actually invest on my charging infrastructure, run it according to my rules and how I want to use it? But then they can actually get an extra source of revenue by making it available, for instance, into a larger network. Of course, there's a lot of challenges there. The players have to be willing to do that. But this type of charge as a service being provided to companies, and we're seeing that, for instance, we're talking about airports. I know an example of an airport where actually the whole charging infrastructure for the airport, for taxis, for the airport operator, for the major airlines, it was all put in place by a major CPO. And actually they put in place a scheme where they can combine like employee charging with taxi charging and with different sets of rules. I know it's complex, I know it sounds amazing and it has its own problems, but I think that the whole point is what are these new kind of value streams that are just there, right? And should we put in place infrastructure that is just going to be used for our own business instead of looking at the bigger picture and how we can actually optimize the deployment of infrastructure. Okay, so technically there's little that can't be done. Then it's just a matter of business and regulation to be enforced.
I am so sorry that we've run out of time. I could speak to you all for another hour, but I'm not allowed. So I do need to wrap it up. But thank you all so much for taking the time to join us this morning. And like I said, yeah, that conversation could have gone on. So we'll have to do it again sometime soon. But just to wrap things up for this morning, just a couple of things that I need to flag in terms of some more events that we've got coming in 2023. So we have a deep dive event where we'll be looking at battery health. So things like degradation rates, usage patterns, some of the solutions and data, and really unpacking the battery health mystery and how we protect residual values. That's going to be on the 16th of May. Details should be available on our website. We have our Fleets in Charge conference. Please do put the 20th of September in your diaries. It's going to be bigger and better than before. It's going to be held at the QE2 Centre in London, and more details will follow. We also then have another webinar scheduled for the 8th of November, where we'll be looking around energy and charging systems of the future. So batteries as a vehicle to grid. How do we manage the grid? Is smart enough? We are always looking for partners to work with us on these events. So if you are interested in partnering with us, speaking or sponsoring, please do drop us an email, brandpartnerships@bvrla.co.uk. And finally, just to remind everybody, thanks again to you for joining this morning. The video will be available on our website and also on Decarbonising Transport Week. And please do remember that there are more live and free webinars throughout the week as part of Decarbonising Transport Week. So please do tune in. Thank you all so much for joining this morning, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thank you then. Bye-bye.